So what I want to do in this video is talk you through the whole of the self-build process. I regularly get calls from people who are still rather flummoxed about what the whole process is. So I'm going to start off with a really simple layout of the 6 key processes, and then I'm going to talk each of those through at a fairly high overview level, and then I'm going to delve into each of them in quite a bit more detail. And then finally, what I want to do is just overlay our turnkey process over the top of all of this so you can see how the whole thing fits together. So the first step in the process is the project appraisal, which is about understanding the parameters for the project. The next is developing the conceptual design of the scheme with the client from the brief. Then we move on to planning drawings, so preparing all the necessary drawings and documents for a planning application. Then, after a period of time, we get planning permission, and we can move on to preparing technical drawings from which the house can be accurately priced and built. And then finally, the construction phase, which is preceded by the signing of a fixed priced contract. Okay, so let's have a look at this project appraisal. Now, if you're going to undertake a self-build project and you want to make the most of what your site offers, and you want to maximize your chance of getting through the planning process alive, and you want to maximize your chances of being able to build your project within your budget, you really can't overestimate the value of doing a thorough project appraisal. Okay, so it's always the first step in our process. So let me talk you through it fairly quickly. The first part is about understanding what the client wants to achieve. So we'll have taken a brief from the client. Then we look at all the planning history, because you need to understand what planning policy will and will not allow. It's really important to understand if the site is in any designated areas, like areas of outstanding natural beauty or conservation areas or even green belt. So you know what can and cannot be achieved on the site from a planning perspective. The last thing you want is to end up with a design that won't get through planning. You need to understand things like access to the site, any issues that highways might have with the site, and so on. And then a site analysis where you understand where the sun's coming from, both winter and summer, what the prevailing winds are, where are the views, and so on. It's imperative for the designer, the architect that's going to be working with you, to make sure they really understand what the site offers. Understanding risks on the site is really important. So things like ground contamination, because that costs quite a lot to mitigate against. Ground conditions that might affect the foundations for the site. What services are coming to the site, but also what services might be running across the site. The last thing you want to do is get planning permission for a house on your site only to discover later on, possibly as late as breaking ground, that there's something that prevents you from building the house where it's been located within the planning permission. Then getting a full brief, so understand the character of the house you want to create, lifestyle issues that might impact on the design of the house, or how the design of the house might improve your lifestyle and the way you live. So the next step is a spatial arrangements exercise. So this is where we sit with a client, and with them we work out how the spaces and rooms in their house should flow. At this stage, we're not thinking about doors and windows and furniture and that sort of stuff. We're just thinking on a very conceptual level, how should this house work and how should it flow? How should it relate to the site? Where are the views? Where should it be connected visually and physically to the site? We often do an area analysis to work out how much house will need to be built in order to deliver what the client wants from the house. Then we do some financial analysis to make sure that what the client is trying to achieve from their house is deliverable within their budget. As part of that financial analysis, thought needs to be given to the things that will be over and above the construction of the house. You might have demolition of an existing building, There will be engineering calculations. There'll be SAP calculations, which determine the energy performance of the house. You'll have some statutory fees for things such as your planning fees, your building regulations fees. There'll be costs for architectural fees. You may have a range of surveys that are needed, such as arboricultural survey, maybe ecological survey. If the ground conditions are a bit suspect, you might want to have a ground conditions survey done to establish what the ground conditions are so that the foundations can be designed accordingly. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration, as well as the construction costs, if you're going to end up with a robust financial analysis during this appraisal part of the process. So we previously looked at the first stage of the self-build process, which was the project appraisal. So now we're going to move on to stage 2.
Okay, so this next stage is all about the creative part of the process, where your architect or your architectural designer really needs to be exploring what's possible on the site in the context of the planning parameters as we discussed earlier in the project appraisal, and of course your brief and your budget. But it is a creative part of the process. It normally results in a sort of plethora of sketches, in this case looking at the levels on the site because it's quite a sloping site. The general form of the building starts to evolve. Again, levels on the site, a layout of the rooms might start to evolve in a very sketchy format. They're literally just being sketched out as zones in the house. That evolves on into a more formalised layout of the house, and it'll progress. This may not be for a single option, of course. What the architect might do is explore a number of different options.
What's really important in this part of the process is that your architect is using this as an exploratory process. Now, it could be if you've got a small site and a modest budget, what they're doing is using their creativity and their skills to maximize the amount of space that you can get from your budget on the site in order to deliver as much as they can from the brief that you've got. If you've got a larger site, they might be exploring different locations on the site, different orientations of the building, different forms and shapes of building. So it really is a stage in the process where a really good architectural designer or architect brings an awful lot of value to the process. Remembering that, of course, for most people, you're doing this once and you really want to get it right. So what would normally happen is that those sketches would evolve probably in CAD just to look at the form of the building a bit further with the client, look at how the form relates to the outside spaces. Now, this particular scheme happens to be on a site that's located next to the client's current listed building. So the architect wanted to take some cues from that building, in this case the pitch, in order to help the building sit comfortably on the site, and of course help keep the conservation officer on side. So we then went on to look at different pitches, different heights of building, single story, 2-story, 1.5 story. Look at these perhaps in 3D to help the client understand what the options are, and then perhaps use some photographs to help illustrate to the client the sort of thing that he's got in mind. It's really important, obviously, at this stage to make sure that the architect is completely in alignment with what you're looking to achieve from your building. It's your house, it's your budget, it's your plot. So making sure that the architect is articulating a design that you're comfortable with at this relatively early stage is hugely important. Okay, so moving on. We're now going to look at the planning part of the process, where the actual planning application is made. And the drawings that were developed during the conceptual part of the design process can evolve into a more formal set of drawings that are required for planning.
Okay, so I'm just going to show you a fairly typical set of drawings that go in for a planning application. These are supported by a number of other documents, but just to give you an idea of what the drawings are, we have a site layout, slightly more detailed site layout here showing each of the houses, because in this case this is an application for 4 houses on the same site. It was quite a contentious application, so we've enhanced this one a little bit with some sort of perspectives and visuals of the individual houses, because we're particularly trying to sell this application to the planners. Floor layouts, very simple floor layouts at this stage. These don't need to be fully resolved at this part of the process, just sufficiently that we know that the external finishes of the house aren't going to change. Elevations of the house, we've enhanced this with a few finishes and materials, again just to try and sell this a little bit more to the planners because it was quite a contentious application. And a couple of perspectives, not entirely necessary, but again selling these to the planner because of the sensitivity of the site, if you like.
So let me just talk you through some of the other documents that are required with a planning application. Most planning authorities will have a list of documents that they require before they'll register the application. And bear in mind that the typical 8-week determination period doesn't start until the application is registered. So you might need ecological surveys, arboricultural surveys. Some sites might require a planning statement to support the argument for developing the site if it isn't clear under policy that one can do so. And this may be a time when a planning consultant would be brought on board just to help articulate that argument because they are specialists in planning policy. Now, one last thing before making the planning application itself is it's really important to get a cost check done at this stage. Now, you may recall we did a cost analysis in the appraisal part of the process. Now the scheme is fundamentally designed in terms of design complexity or simplicity, size of building, etc., etc. It's imperative to get a cost check done, either by a quantity surveyor, a QS. An architect might be able to help out. Here at Complete Oak Home, we actually have our own in-house cost consultant, but it's really worth getting that cost check done. What you don't want to do is get planning permission for a house you can't afford to build that doesn't fall within your budget. Once all the relevant documents are together, the planning application can be submitted. These days that is normally done online. And then the process of monitoring it can follow up. Okay, so we're moving on a stage now. Just look briefly at the application determination. Couple of things to note here. Once the application is made, it should be registered, but it will only be registered if it is supported with all the necessary documentation. The simple application, that could be a set of drawings and the application form itself. If it's a more complex site, it might require support from, say, a heritage statement or a visual impact survey. So one needs to make sure that the local authority are happy that they've got all the relevant supporting documentation and have registered it. The 8-week determination period will only start once the application is registered. And the first part of that determination period is a consultation period where the planning documents will go out to the relevant consultees, such as highways or conservation. And their feedback is typically received shortly after that 3-week period. And it is worth having a look to see what their feedback is. What we would do then is if there was any feedback we felt we needed to deal with, to provide the authorities with more information, particularly if that is negative feedback, then we'll do that to try and keep the application on track for a determination at the end of the 8-week period. Once the application is determined, you will get a planning approval document, and this will set out a series of conditions under which the planning has been approved. And typically they'll refer to things that have to be done before the development commences, called pre-commencement conditions, and things that have to happen before occupation of the house. So there'll be a series of conditions, but those are things that your architect will advise you about and typically help you make sure those conditions are satisfied at the appropriate parts of the process. So we're going to move on to the next stage, which is the development of the construction drawings and a finishes schedule. Now, these documents are absolutely imperative to provide documents from which the building can be accurately costed, the documents from which it can be accurately built, and also to provide the basis for a really robust contract, because the contract, which we'll come on to, will ultimately refer to these documents. So within a set of construction drawings, there are a range of different drawings, and it will typically comprise about 30 to 40 different drawings for a one-off bespoke house. Everything from foundation plans that we can see here through to more detailed floor layouts. Now, you may recall the planning drawings were a very simple floor layout. Here we have very specific dimensions for everything from doors and windows to wall positions and so on for both floors of the house. We have roof layouts. We have here, for example, floor finishes throughout the house. We have heating zones for the house. And then we have elevations with an awful lot more information than would have been on them for the planning application. These elevations will show a lot of detailed finishes, and then we'll get sections. These are showing the builder exactly how the house is to be built. And then we'll get into a lot more detail, here showing sections through various parts of the house and exactly how the house is to be constructed. We'll also have, for example, the building regulations, which are set out here on a final page in the document. So something that happens alongside the development of the construction drawings is the development of a finisher schedule. Now, this is a document that you develop along with your architect or architectural designer to make sure that you're clearly specifying all the products and materials in every part of the house. Like the construction drawings, it is crucial for making sure you know exactly what is going to go into your building in terms of finishes and products. It's crucial to getting an accurate cost, and it's also crucial to underpinning the contract, because again, the final contract will refer to the construction drawings and this finishes schedule. And that means the contract administrator can make sure the build is being built to the right level of specification as agreed under the contract. So we're on the stage just before construction can start, and this is preparing the contract. There are two parties to the contract. That would be the client and the main contractor, with a contract administrator, which would normally be either your architect. In our case, it would be us acting for our clients. Contract administrator is responsible for making sure that all parties adhere to the terms of the contract. Now, what that really means from a client's perspective is the contract administrator coming to site every few weeks, making sure the building is being constructed to the terms of the contract, dealing with any valuations. So at the end of each month, the builder will submit a valuation for the work done in that month. Contract administrator will review that and make sure it's a fair and reasonable determination of the value. That can then be passed to the client by the builder with an invoice. The contract administrator will also deal with any variations. So if you choose as the client to change the contract in some way, then the contract administrator will make sure that when the builder gives a valuation for that variation, up or down, that it is a fair valuation of the work to be added or taken out. The contract administrator will also issue certificates at various stages of the work, for example, at practical completion. Now, the contract will be a fixed price contract. Now, that fixed price should be in alignment with the budget that you originally discussed with your design team, because throughout the development of the construction drawings and the finishes schedule, they should have been advising you on the decisions you've been making so that you've been able to keep your project within your budget. So at the point of putting the fixed price down into the contract, following a process of either tender or negotiated contract, that fixed price should be in alignment with your expectations. So this is our roadmap for our complete turnkey service, which integrates with the whole of the complete self-build process I previously talked about. It starts with an initial free of charge consultation meeting, And if out of that meeting you decide that we're the right company to be progressing your project with, we start by undertaking a project appraisal. And that starts with a brief of your project, understanding your drivers for the project, the character of the house you want to build, and particularly your budget, which is an important part of that brief. We undertake a desktop study looking at planning issues, fully understanding your brief, and doing some analysis on how much house you will need to build to deliver your project. And we write up a comprehensive project appraisal, which we would then come back and discuss with you. If from that appraisal you're confident your project can be delivered to meet your brief within the budget that you've got, and we've given you sufficient confidence that any planning issues can be addressed, then we can move on to the first tranche of design development. This is about evolving the drawings so that they can be submitted for planning. That's a collaborative process with you as the client. And that can then move on to a planning application submission, typically taking about 8 weeks for a determination, depending on the complexity, sensitive of the site, and so on. Once we've got planning approval, we can start to develop construction drawings. This is the detailed set of drawings from which the house will be costed and built. And crucially, these documents will form part of the eventual contract so that you have a robust contract from which the house will be built. And we further evaluate the costs with you. We'll guide and advise you throughout the process on the decisions you're making to help you keep your project within your budget. As those technical drawings develop, they will also go on to further development through structural engineering, civil engineering for things like drainage, groundworks, and so on, and further cost evaluation until we end up with a final fixed price for the building, and we can go on and prepare a contract, a formal construction contract. This would be a fixed price contract. Once the contract is signed, construction can start and progress month on month with us acting as the contract administrator, making sure that the project is being delivered according to the terms of the contract, until eventually we get to practical completion, which is where you move in. And then there is what is known as a 12-month rectification period where you're living in the house. At the end of that period, we will come back, make sure any snagging is dealt with, and issue a final completion certificate, which is actually the end of the formal contract. So that covers the whole of our turnkey roadmap.